On November 24th, 2011, 23-year-old Victoria Shakte sat in her wheelchair at the dining room table inside of her apartment in Innisfail, Alberta, Canada. On the kitchen table sat a fresh pizza, and then a balloon was tied to the back of one of the chairs. Victoria and her full-time caregiver, Mrballen, were celebrating. Marlene, who was originally from the Philippines, had just received her permanent resident status in Canada. This meant that Marlene now was able to receive a range of social benefits provided by the country, and she could now take steps towards becoming an official Canadian citizen. So this was a huge deal for Marlene, and Victoria was just so happy for her. But despite being such good friends and having so much in common and just really getting along, the two women really could not have looked more different. Victoria had dyed red and blonde hair, she had a pierced nose, and she loved wearing really bright colors, in particular red. As for Marlene, she was much more modest. She had dark eyes and dark hair that she always kept perfectly combed, and then even when she wasn't working, she dressed very sensibly. But for anybody who knew these two, Victoria and Marlene seemed like sisters most of the time, and Victoria relied on Marlene more than anybody else in her life. When Victoria was just 16 years old, she had been in this terrible car accident. Her friend, who was driving, was speeding at over 140 miles per hour when they lost control and flipped the car. The accident had left Victoria a quadriplegic, which meant she suffered significant paralysis below her neck. Now, at the time, Victoria's friends and family were obviously so relieved that Victoria had survived the accident. But, looking at her paralysis, her friends and family were worried that Victoria's life would ever go back to being even close to what it used to be. But even at a young age, Victoria had always been very resilient and put her faith wholly in God. And so through the years of extensive medical treatments, she always stayed positive and strong. And over time, she had actually regained some movement in her arms and hands, and she had sort of built a new life for herself. Now, that life was very different from the one she had growing up, but she still cherished it. And Victoria's life had only gotten better when Marlene had become her caregiver and physiotherapist 3 years earlier. In addition to helping Victoria with her physical therapy, Marlene helped prepare food, she got Victoria ready for the day, and she kept the apartment clean. Marlene also helped look after Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, Destiny. Back at the kitchen table, Marlene and Victoria ate their pizza and talked about how exciting it was that Marlene was now one step closer to becoming a Canadian citizen. After they finished eating, Marlene got up and began to clean the kitchen, and Victoria wheeled herself down the hall to her daughter's room. Destiny's door was cracked open, and Victoria could see her daughter sleeping soundly. Victoria smiled. There were times when she looked at her daughter and just felt like bursting out into tears of joy, because she believed her daughter really was a miracle. When Victoria had gotten into that car accident, she was 4 months pregnant. Victoria had been pinned in the wrecked car for 45 minutes before EMTs could get to her, and by the time she was taken to the hospital, she feared she had lost the baby. But 5 months later, her daughter had been born happy and healthy. Victoria chose the name Destiny because she felt like it had been her destiny to have this little girl. Then, years later, Victoria and her daughter had moved to the small town of Innisfail, which is said to get its name from an Irish word that meant Isle of Destiny. So, watching her daughter sleep soundly that night, Victoria felt like, everything that had happened in her life, including the accident that paralyzed her, had happened for a reason, and that she was meant to be exactly where she was right now with Destiny and with Marlene. Later in the evening, Victoria was starting to feel worn out, so she asked Marlene for some help. Victoria said she needed to make an important phone call, so Marlene pushed her down the hall to a small home office, and then she left. That way Victoria could have some privacy on her call. Then Victoria called her financial advisor, Brian Malley. Brian had been a friend of the family for years. He ran a successful construction business, and he had played a huge role in making Victoria's ground floor apartment more wheelchair accessible for her. Brian also owned a small financial firm in town where he worked with locals and people in the area, helping them invest, balance budgets, and manage their money. And managing money had been another major way that Brian had been helping Victoria. Years after her accident, Victoria had sued the person who had been driving the car that hit her, and she had been awarded a settlement of about 575,000 Canadian dollars. With so much money, Victoria had turned to Brian for some guidance, and he had worked to help her make some smart investments and to limit her spending. Brian answered the phone, and for a few minutes, he and Victoria just caught up on what was going on in their lives. Victoria told him the good news about Marlene becoming a permanent resident, and Brian told Victoria that he was excited because he was making the 2-hour drive to Edmonton for business, and so his wife could go to the opera. After a few minutes of this, Victoria finally brought up the reason that she had actually called. She needed Brian to move several $1,000s from her investment account into her checking account to cover her rent and bills and things like that. Victoria immediately heard Brian exhale sort of frustratedly. He told her he was getting concerned about her spending and that her investment account had really begun to dwindle significantly over the past year. Brian tried not to sound too harsh, but he told Victoria that he really couldn't understand why she wasn't sticking to the budget they had laid out for her. Victoria fell silent for a second, and then in a very quiet voice, she said to Brian that the reason she needed more money was to help her family. Brian said he totally understood how important taking care of family was to Victoria, but he said, you're one of 5 kids and you're giving too much money to your siblings. Now, even though Brian did not specifically say this, Victoria knew what Brian was really saying was there was one sibling in particular that Victoria was helping that Brian did not agree with, and that was one of her brothers. The young man had a very serious history of drug use, and Brian was very sure he was just throwing away the money Victoria was giving him to feed his drug addiction. But ultimately, Brian knew it was Victoria's decision what she did with her money, and so Brian said he would call his office and see what he could do about moving the money. But he urged Victoria to really think hard about whether it was worth giving away all this money. After Victoria hung up, she found herself thinking about her family. After she had gotten that court settlement, her first instinct was to use that money to better the lives of everybody in her family, and she had done that, and she was really happy about it. And so even though she knew Brian was making a good point that maybe it was not the best decision to give all her money away to her siblings, she just felt like she had to. And in fact, she couldn't even imagine not helping her siblings or her family out at this point. In particular, her brother who was struggling with drugs. In fact, Victoria believed her kind of red flag brother deserved the most help out of anybody because of his drug use. A couple of minutes later, Victoria called out to Marlene and asked her to come into the study. When she did, Marlene took Victoria and wheeled her to Victoria's bedroom. There, Marlene massaged Victoria's legs like she did every night, and then she helped her get ready for bed. They talked through their plan for the following day. Destiny had to be at school early, and then Victoria wanted to go see her stepfather. Then after that, they said goodnight to each other, and then Marlene stepped out of the room. For a little while, Victoria just lay awake in bed, feeling more stressed out than usual. And the reason she was stressed was about her money. She was thinking about what Brian said and whether or not it was a good idea to be giving all her money to her siblings and her family. And Victoria, she hated thinking about money. It really stressed her out to begin with. But she also told herself that she was going to see her stepfather the following day, and he always had great advice for her. And so maybe he would have some great financial advice. And so with that in mind, and also Victoria's steadfast belief that, no matter her problems, God had a plan for her, Victoria was able to eventually drift off to sleep. The next morning, so November 25th, 2011, Victoria and Marlene woke up early and made Destiny breakfast and got her off to school. Then, back at the apartment, Marlene helped Victoria get ready to go see her stepfather. But right as they were about to leave, there was a knock at the front door. Marlene walked across the living room and opened the door, but there was nobody there. She looked out into the street, but didn't see anybody walking off. Then Marlene looked down at the porch, and she saw there was this large, shiny green and gold gift bag that had no tag on it, and so Marlene just picked it up and stared for a second, wondering who had sent it and who it was for. Marlene walked back inside carrying the gift, and she told Victoria that she didn't think it was a good idea to open it right now because they had no idea where it came from. But Victoria thought Marlene was acting paranoid. To Victoria, this gift was clearly just an early Christmas present. Marlene disagreed and even suggested they should call the police. Victoria rolled her eyes and said that was a huge overreaction, but she could tell Marlene felt really uncomfortable about this gift, so Victoria promised she would not open it up. Marlene put the gift in the kitchen, and then she and Victoria left and went to go see Victoria's stepfather, who lived only a few minutes away. When they got there, Victoria's stepfather greeted the two women with a huge smile on his face, and he welcomed them into his home. A few minutes after they got there, Marlene helped Victoria to the shower. Victoria's stepfather's shower was actually much more accessible than her own, and so Victoria really enjoyed using it anytime she visited. But the shower also gave her an excuse to catch up with her stepfather. The two had been very close since he came into Victoria's life when she was a young girl, and she often turned to him for advice. So, after her shower, Victoria told her stepfather about the money issues she was having that she spoke to her financial advisor, Brian, about the day before. And just like Brian, Victoria's stepfather was also pretty visibly concerned about the fact that Victoria's money was dwindling so quickly. He told her that it was noble that she liked to help everybody she loved, but she needed to remember that that money was hers, and taking care of herself and her daughter should really be her priority, not everybody else. They talked a while longer, and then eventually Victoria asked him if he knew anything about the early Christmas present that had just shown up on her doorstep. At this point, Marlene jumped into the conversation and told Victoria's stepfather that there hadn't been a card or a tag or anything on this present, and she hadn't seen who had left it at the door. And then Marlene said, I told Victoria that we should not only not open this gift, but we should also call the police and let them handle it. And as Victoria's stepfather listened to this, he too started feeling pretty paranoid about this gift. And he told Victoria that, yeah, you should call the police and definitely do not open that bag. You don't know what it is. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was everybody so worried about this early Christmas present? Come on. But at the same time, Victoria did not want to upset people, so she told her stepfather that she would not open the gift. A little bit later, Victoria thanked her stepfather for having them over. She told him she loved him, and then she and Marlene headed home. They got back to the apartment just before 9 a.m. Marlene walked right to the kitchen and began washing dishes from breakfast. She grabbed a plate off the counter and began running water over it, when suddenly there was this huge bang that echoed through the apartment, and the entire apartment shook, and parts of the ceiling began coming down. And Marlene, she began screaming because she had no idea what was going on. She figured this must be an earthquake, but she didn't know. And so after a second of just pure terror and shock, Marlene turned and ran out of the kitchen and went into the living room yelling out for Victoria, because again, she has no idea what's going on here. But when Marlene saw Victoria, she was slumped forward in her wheelchair and blood was pouring out of her neck. And so Marlene just ran through all the dust and the smoke in the room and went out the front door and just started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. A neighbor who lived not far from Victoria's small apartment building had come out of his house after hearing that very loud noise. And now he looked up the street and he saw Marlene screaming for help. And so the neighbor immediately grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and ran to Marlene. And when he reached Marlene, he could see very clearly that she had cuts on her body and she was bleeding. But Marlene kept saying, "Somebody needs to go inside. Victoria needs help." And the neighbor happened to be a former volunteer firefighter, so he ran into the apartment without hesitation. Once he was inside, there was all this dust and smoke in the air, and it really made it hard to breathe, and he began to cough. But eventually, after walking through the haze, he saw Victoria in her wheelchair, and so he rushed over to her, and he saw she wasn't moving, and so he reached down to check for a pulse or any sign of life. But after a few seconds of just looking at Victoria, it was clear she was already deceased. And so the neighbor ran back out of the house and sat down next to Marlene, who was collapsed on the ground crying, and just took her hand and tried to comfort her as best as he could as they waited for the emergency personnel to arrive. Seconds later, fire trucks, police cruisers, and an ambulance roared through the small town of Innisfail, and they arrived in front of Victoria's apartment just minutes after the neighbor had made that 911 call. First responders helped Marlene and the neighbor off the lawn and then tended to Marlene's cuts. There was no active fire going on inside the apartment, but still, firefighters were the first to go inside. And when they got in there, they quickly identified that clearly an explosion had happened inside of this apartment. And from what they were seeing, the explosion had not been accidental. Someone had set off an incendiary device. And so the firefighters went back outside, and they would contact local, regional, and national authorities about what they had just found inside of the apartment. Not long after those calls, members of the explosives disposal unit arrived. Members of the EDU are national and regional Canadian police officers trained to detect, disarm, and dispose of explosive devices like bombs. Several EDU officers filed out of a truck in front of Victoria's apartment. They wore these huge 90-pound bomb suits made from protective materials like Kevlar, and they had helmets and blast shields that covered their heads and faces. Several of Marlene's neighbors had come out onto their porches to watch, and from their perspective, it almost looked like a group of astronauts had invaded their street. Inside of Victoria's apartment, the explosives unit did a thorough sweep of every room to make sure there was no longer a bomb threat, and they concluded that the apartment was clear, and so it was time now for investigators and forensic analysts to take over. Corporal Kenmore Deep DeHill of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is Canada's national police force, arrived at Victoria's apartment with several forensic investigators right behind him. DeHill quickly met with the officers who had gotten to the scene first, and they filled him in with information they had taken from Marlene. They told him the woman who had died inside the apartment was Victoria Shockday. She was 23 years old, and she was a quadriplegic. The officers also said that Marlene had told them about some sort of mysterious gift that had been dropped off outside of the apartment earlier that morning without any kind of card or tag on it. DeHill nodded and then scanned the street. The neighbors had now gotten even closer to the scene, trying to figure out what had happened. The officers pushed them back and told them they needed to stay a safe distance away from Victoria's apartment. Amidst this growing crowd, DeHill saw Marlene. She was sitting with first responders with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He could tell she was in shock. DeHill wanted to talk to her, but first he wanted to get a better idea of what he was dealing with. So he thanked the officers he was talking with for their help, and then DeHill stepped inside the apartment. Forensics analysts told him that they had already found pieces of a galvanized steel pipe, traces of gunpowder, and a lantern battery, clear signs of a homemade bomb. DeHill tried to take in the entire scene. Parts of the walls and floors had been ripped apart, pieces of furniture had gaping holes in them, debris were scattered everywhere, and strands of plaster hung down from the ceiling like confetti. But the real horror was where Victoria was, in the dining room. DeHill walked into the dining room and approached Victoria. She was sitting in her wheelchair with her head slumped forward. DeHill saw multiple serious wounds on Victoria's neck, as well as bloodstains on her skin and all over her torn clothes. DeHill didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but he had been a member of the Major Crimes Unit for years, and he knew that homicides involving pipe bombs like this were often connected to drug gangs. But that just didn't make sense to DeHill. The victim was a young woman who was paralyzed and who had no criminal history at all. Why would she be mixed up with a drug gang? Corporal DeHill made his way down the hall to the bedrooms. He looked into Destiny's bedroom, and all he could think was how glad he was that Victoria's little girl had been at school when this happened. Minutes later, someone shouted for DeHill out in the dining room. So DeHill stopped what he was doing, and he walked down the hall to the dining room, and when he got there, DeHill saw a forensics officer crouch down, staring at something on the ground. She was staring at something that she just uncovered from the dust and the pieces of the ceiling that had fallen to the floor, and she could not believe what she was looking at. DeHill knelt down beside her, and he looked at what she was staring at, and what he saw was a piece of paper with Victoria's name written on it in colored ink. Marlene had previously told the officers that this Christmas present they received did not have a tag on it, but this piece of paper definitely looked like a tag that would go on a gift, at least to DeHill. The forensics officer told DeHill that finding a scrap of paper like this fully intact after an explosion was almost unheard of. And that little piece of paper gave DeHill a jolt of energy, because it could possibly offer a handwriting sample of the bomber. And even more importantly, potentially there could be the bomber's DNA on the paper. So the forensics team bagged up the piece of paper for testing and then continued looking for evidence all throughout the apartment. Later that day, DeHill finally stepped outside of the apartment, and the fresh air felt like it might knock him over. He hadn't realized how difficult it was to breathe inside of the apartment. DeHill caught his breath and then noticed Marlene standing by the road with several officers. The wounds that Marlene had suffered during the explosion wound up being quite minor, so she was able to answer any questions that the officers had. And so DeHill saw this as his chance, and so he walked over to her and introduced himself. Marlene wiped away the tears from her face, and then she told DeHill that she had warned Victoria not to open that gift. And so when DeHill heard this, he followed up with, "Well, Marlene, why were you so worried about this gift? Did you think somebody was planning to attack Victoria?" But Marlene would say, in response to this, that her suspicion about the present had nothing to do with fear that somebody was out to hurt Victoria. She just didn't trust the fact that this present had been dropped off completely randomly a month before the holidays with no tags on it, nothing. It just seemed like something was off about this gift. And then after that, Marlene just sort of broke down. She told DeHill that people loved Victoria and looked to her as an inspiration. Victoria had endured so much for someone so young, but she never let anything stop her. In fact, Victoria often went out of her way to help other people who needed it, whether it was by giving money to her family or volunteering at her church. She was just a very thoughtful person. DeHill told Marlene how sorry he was for her loss and for what she had been through that morning with the explosion. DeHill knew Marlene was physically okay, but he was sure she would never get over what had happened. Then he thanked her for her time and walked back towards the apartment. And as he was on his way, one thing Marlene had said to DeHill really stood out to him, that Victoria apparently gave money to her family. Money, family, and murder often went hand in hand, so DeHill instructed members of his team to begin looking into Victoria's financial situation, and he asked others to track down members of her family for questioning. DeHill still had not formed any serious theories or opinions about who could have delivered this pipe bomb, but he thought maybe in this case, a family dispute over money that maybe erupted into violence might make more sense than a drug gang putting out a hit on somebody like Victoria. So DeHill just needed to figure out who all Victoria was giving money to and who would have benefited from her death. On the night of Victoria's murder, and during the following day, Corporal DeHill and members of his team had contacted and took statements from Victoria's family and friends, and they all basically said the same thing. They loved Victoria. She was a beautiful person and an amazing mother, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. And Victoria's family were very upfront about the financial aid she had given them all since she'd received her court settlement. But they all insisted that they never wanted to feel like a burden to Victoria and that she helped them because it was something she wanted to do. Now, despite how honest the family and friends seemed to DeHill, he couldn't actually just rule them out because they seemed like good people. The reality was they still needed more information to get to the bottom of Victoria's financial situation to see if that played a role in whatever happened to her. And in conversations with family and friends, DeHill had learned that Victoria had a financial advisor, Brian Malley, who would obviously have a much fuller picture of Victoria's finances. And so DeHill reached out to Brian and asked him to come meet him at a nearby police station. Brian was a 55-year-old guy who was quite tall and had graying hair. He was known for being very polite and outgoing, traits that had really helped him grow his business. Brian told DeHill that he'd actually been a friend of Victoria's family for years, and he had really gotten to know Victoria when he did construction work on her apartment to make it more wheelchair accessible. He also said when he and Victoria began working together on her finances, that also really brought them together, so they were legitimately good friends. DeHill asked him about his investment strategy for Victoria, and Brian would say, the strategy was very standard. His goal was just to add to the money that Victoria already had. That way her and her daughter could be taken care of in the future. And then he also asked Brian if he could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Victoria. And when he asked that question, it was the first time Brian seemed to hesitate. And for a second, DeHill actually thought maybe Brian just didn't hear the question, and he was about to ask it again, but then Brian shook his head and broke the silence and said he just could not imagine anybody wanting to do this to Victoria. It just really didn't make sense. DeHill would ask Brian a few more questions, and Brian would do his best to answer, and then eventually DeHill thanked Brian for coming in, and Brian got up to leave. But even before Brian made it out the door, DeHill found himself thinking how strange it was that Brian had hesitated when he was asked, is there anybody out there that you think might want to hurt Victoria? Everybody else who DeHill had asked that question to, family, friends, witnesses, had all pretty much immediately said, no, there's no one. Nobody would want to hurt her. Or certainly I don't know anybody who would want to hurt her. And Brian had basically had the same answer, but again, he had hesitated. And so it could have just been, a brain fart or he zoned out or something, or maybe there was something more to the hesitation. And so DeHill decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. And DeHill did not need to wait long to get his answer, because the following day, Brian contacted DeHill, and what he said cast Victoria's murder in a whole new light. Brian told DeHill that one of Victoria's brothers, who she gave money to all the time, had a very serious drug problem. he'd been addicted to crack for years. But that wasn't all. Brian also thought there was a real chance that Victoria's brother was a drug dealer and that he had gotten on the wrong side of some pretty serious drug gangs. And so by the time DeHill hung up with Brian, he felt like he had just caught his first major break in this case. One of DeHill's initial thoughts about the crime scene was that the type of homemade bomb used to kill Victoria was often used by people in the drug trade. So DeHill wondered if it was possible that Victoria's brother owed money to drug dealers or had encroached on their territory when dealing drugs on his own or something. And if that was the case, maybe those drug dealers killed Victoria to send a message to her brother. And so soon after this call with Brian, DeHill raced off to go speak with Victoria's brother. And when he did and actually began talking to him, the young man tried to be as helpful as he could, and he admitted openly to struggling with drugs in the past. But he said he never dealt drugs to anyone, and the idea that he had connections to major drug gangs was laughable. DeHill was not ready to just take this guy at his word, but one thing DeHill definitely noticed was Victoria's brother was visibly angry that somebody even suggested that he had something to do with his sister's death. He told DeHill he loved Victoria, probably more than he'd loved anybody else in the world. And so after this meeting ended, DeHill did not think he had just gotten any closer to solving the case. However, at the same time, he wasn't ready to just drop the possible connection between drugs and Victoria's murder. And so for now, at least, that was still the best lead he had. On December 3rd, 2011, so a week after Victoria's murder, 250 people gathered at a funeral home to say their final goodbyes to Victoria and to celebrate her life. DeHill and other police officers attended the funeral as well. It's common for investigators to go to funerals of murder victims to see how their friends and family and other potential suspects behave. DeHill listened to the people who were closest to Victoria talk about what an unbelievably amazing person she was, and as he listened to this, he just struggled to understand how someone as wonderful as Victoria ended up with a homemade pipe bomb getting delivered to her house. Now, DeHill had continued to pursue Victoria's brother's possible connection to drug gangs, and in doing that, he had discovered that years earlier, Victoria had made an anonymous call to the police about her neighbors dealing drugs. But DeHill still didn't know if that call had anything to do with her brother, or if somehow the neighbors had figured out who made the anonymous call and then took their revenge on Victoria. But DeHill just could not fathom why any drug dealer would wait years to exact their revenge for a phone call to the cops that didn't really amount to much. A procession of mourners made their way towards Victoria's casket, but DeHill focused on Victoria's young daughter, Destiny. Whoever had done this to Victoria, whether they were connected to the drug trade or not, had robbed this little girl of her mother and robbed her of a safe, happy childhood. Seeing Destiny struggling so hard just to talk about her mother made DeHill so mad. And he was also very frustrated that still he had not honed in on one or two major suspects yet. But still, DeHill tried to stay steady and level-headed. He had plenty of information to work with. He just needed more time to figure out what it all meant. After the funeral, DeHill returned to the station and met with his team. He decided this case could very well hinge on the old adage, follow the money. If they could track where Victoria's money went after she gave it to her brother, it could lead them to the person or people they were looking for. So, for the next several weeks, investigators looked into Victoria's financial transactions dating back to when she had received her court settlement. And investigators were able to follow a paper trail of where and when Victoria's money moved. And something they found set off a major alarm. Finally, DeHill had a full picture of what Victoria had done with her money, and he was almost positive he now knew who had killed her. DeHill wanted to act fast, but he also wanted his case to be airtight if it went to trial. So he needed a key piece of evidence that he still lacked. Forensics investigators had managed to pull DNA samples from that piece of paper with Victoria's name on it that had somehow survived the explosion. So now, DeHill just had to secure a DNA sample from his newly discovered suspect to see if the DNA matched. Almost 6 months after Victoria's murder, 2 investigators trailed their suspect from an unmarked car. The Major Crimes Unit had secured a warrant that allowed them to conduct surveillance on DeHill's new primary suspect. The surveillance process had been very in-depth, and it had taken a lot of time, but it convinced DeHill even further that he was right about who had murdered Victoria. So now, these two investigators who were following the suspect needed to secure a DNA sample from this suspect to back up DeHill's theory. Eventually, the investigators saw the suspect turn off the street and pull into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. The investigators could not believe their luck. This was the perfect place to get a DNA sample. From inside their unmarked car out in the parking lot, the investigators watched the suspect get out of their car and walk inside the restaurant. The investigators waited a minute, and then they too got out of their car and they went inside as well. The investigators bought food just to blend in, and then took a seat in a booth towards the back and kept an eye on their suspect. Eventually, the suspect finished their meal, threw their trash into the trash can, and walked outside. And at this point, the investigators sprung into action. They put gloves on their hands, walked over to the trash can, and began fishing around inside of it until they pulled out a napkin the suspect had used to wipe their hands and mouth, and they slipped that napkin into a paper bag. And soon after that, the napkin was sent off for DNA testing. It took a while for the results to come back, but when they did, they showed DeHill exactly what he had been looking for. They were a match. DeHill had found Victoria's murderer. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and police interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on November 25, 2011, the morning that somebody murdered Victoria Schachté. The sun wouldn't rise for hours, but the killer was already hard at work. They sat at a wooden table staring at their creation. They had spent months collecting the necessary items to complete the project, and now they were finally ready to finish it and put it to use. The killer took a big breath in and exhaled slowly through their mouth. They told themselves that staying calm was key. Shaky hands or sudden movements could be very dangerous. The killer slowly put the finishing touches on the pipe bomb, then backed away from the table and let out a huge breath and felt their shoulders relax. They reached down and picked up a white cardboard box off the floor, and they carefully set the bomb inside of the box. They closed the box and then grabbed a piece of paper and a colored pen, and they wrote the word Victoria in large, festive-looking letters on the paper and then taped it to the top of the cardboard box. Finally, the killer picked up a large green and gold gift bag and placed the box inside. A few minutes later, the killer drove through Innisfail and arrived on Victoria's street. They drove a little ways past her apartment and then parked their car. Then, after pulling their dark cap down to cover their face, the killer stepped out of the car and looked up and down the street. It was empty. So they reached into the passenger seat and took the heavy gift bag containing the bomb, and they walked carefully towards Victoria's apartment. As they moved, they did their best to stay in the shadows and avoid the streetlights. Finally, the killer reached Victoria's apartment, and they placed the gift bag down right in front of the front door, and then the killer knocked on the door and then turned and ran away as fast as they could. By the time Marlene opened the door, the killer was already gone. Hours later, at around 9 a.m., Victoria and Marlene returned from Victoria's stepfather's house, and right away, Marlene headed to the kitchen to do the dishes. But while she was at the sink, she didn't hear or see Victoria, who wheeled herself into the kitchen as well, and Victoria grabbed the gift bag off the kitchen table where Marlene had left it, she put it on her lap, and then wheeled herself into the dining room. Victoria opened up the bag and saw there was a white cardboard box inside. She took the box out and let the bag fall to the floor. And when this happened, Victoria very likely saw that there was a tag on this box. There was that piece of paper that said Victoria in colorful ink. And so for Victoria, this very likely confirmed in her head that Marlene and her stepfather were overreacting about this box. Clearly, this was just an early Christmas present for Victoria, and it was no big deal. And so Victoria ultimately opened up the box. And when she did, the box exploded. And by the time the explosion actually happened, the killer had already arrived in Edmonton, where he had business to conduct, and where his wife was going to see the opera. Brian Malley, Victoria's family friend and her financial advisor, was her killer. It would turn out the image of a kind, outgoing, successful businessman that Brian showed the world was nothing more than an act that he had spent years cultivating. In reality, Brian was a former cop who had been kicked off the Edmonton police force about 3 years after he had joined. Brian's first wife had divorced him because she believed he was a physical threat to her and their daughter, and his second wife had also divorced him because Brian was having an affair with a coworker. But somehow, Brian had managed to hide all of that, and he sort of reinvented himself when he had moved to the small town of Innisfail. And soon, he had established himself as a reliable construction worker, and then later as an honest and trustworthy financial advisor. But the truth was, Brian never really changed, and he made a habit out of using his clients' money for his own gain, making risky and even illegal investments in the hope that he could make some big money on commissions. And he got away with it for a while. But in 2011, Victoria had started to wonder why her large investment account kept dwindling so quickly. When she had asked Brian about it, he just kept saying the problem was that Victoria gave too much of her money away to her family. But when Victoria continued to push him for more information about what was happening, Brian started to panic. Because he had actually invested over 90% of Victoria's money in a single, very high-risk stock. And that stock had just cratered, so almost all of Victoria's money was now gone. And Brian had never consulted Victoria about doing this investment, so she had no idea what had even happened. He also obviously never disclosed the inherent risk of putting so much money into a single stock. Basically, you can lose everything really quickly. Brian knew his actions violated multiple Canadian financial laws, so he decided the only way to avoid getting caught and going to jail was to kill Victoria and pin the murder on her own brother. Now, Victoria's brother had nothing to do with the murder, and it was never shown that he had ever dealt drugs. But ultimately, it was the investigators' initial pursuit of the brother's possible drug connection to this crime that had led DeHill and his team to uncover Brian's financial crimes. But even with all of this information about his financial crimes, DeHill needed something much more concrete to directly connect Brian to the murder. Luckily, that piece of paper Brian had written Victoria on and then taped to the bomb survived the blast, and DNA samples from that paper ended up matching the DNA sample taken from the napkin that Brian had thrown away when he was at the fast food restaurant. And so after finding that match, DeHill and his team moved in and arrested Brian. Brian was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and several charges related to constructing and delivering an explosive device. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole after 25 years.
In the early 1980s, John Harder was the classic, athletic, popular kid at his high school in Delaware, Ohio, which is a relatively small town just outside of the state's capital. But unlike most stereotypes that paint high school jocks as being these total jerks that bully people and they're kind of stupid, John was none of those things. He was incredibly friendly and very warm-hearted and seemed to get along with everyone. John also was known for having a great sense of humor. In particular, he liked to play these kind of harmless pranks that would make people smile, like the time he very enthusiastically joined the cheerleaders during a high school pep rally, despite not actually being a cheerleader himself. John was set to graduate from high school on June 5th, 1983, and his plan was to study accounting at Kent State University the following year. A few weeks before his graduation, John's high school began selling these tickets to a grad night at a huge amusement park called Kings Island. Kings Island was located about 2 hours west of John's high school, and it was home to dozens of roller coasters, water slides, and many other attractions. During their so-called grad nights, this amusement park would shut down their public operations and not let anybody into the park that did not have these special student tickets that they gave to local area high schools. John, who was 17 years old at the time, was very excited at the idea of going to this grad night, and so he went and purchased tickets along with about 20 other students from his high school. At about 3:30 p.m. on Friday, May 13th, John and the other students who had bought grad night tickets met up outside of their high school. While this was a school-sponsored trip, the students were responsible for driving themselves to the park. And so after all the students were accounted for, they all piled into a couple of their cars and they began their journey to the park. After a few stops along the way to get food and go to the bathroom, the students finally arrived at the park at about 7 p.m. And on the drive, John, who had been a passenger, had drank half a bottle of rum and about 3 to 6 beers. And so when he got out, he could barely stand, he was so drunk. And so the students made their way over to the front gate, they showed the attendant their grad night ticket, and they were allowed inside. And surprisingly, despite it being this special night where only people with these tickets were allowed in, it was still pretty crowded. There were lots of students that apparently wanted to come to this event. Once John and the rest of the students from the Delaware High School had come inside the park, there was no rule that they had to stick together for the duration of their time there, and so they all kind of broke into their separate groups and went their separate ways. In John's particular group was his girlfriend Pam, and for the first hour they were in the park together, all they did was bicker and fight. Onlookers would say John looked visibly upset and very emotional and very drunk. By 8:30 p.m., when John's group had gotten in line for this roller coaster, John was now openly saying, "I don't want to be here anymore, I just want to go home." It was pretty obvious he was still just mad at Pam, and that's why he was saying all this, was just trying to make Pam feel bad. And so some of the group members told John, just, "Hey man, calm down, you're overreacting, just try to enjoy this ride, and then afterwards we'll get some food, it'll be fine." But it was pretty clear that John was really worked up and seemed incapable of having a good time at this point. But regardless, John and the rest of the group, they got on this ride at about 9 p.m. And then after the ride was over, they disembarked and they walked away from the ride to regroup and figure out what was next. And they're looking around and John is nowhere to be found. And so after waiting for a few minutes and actually walking around looking for him, they decided that, you know what, he was really upset before he got on this ride. He probably just wanted to walk away and be by himself for a bit. I'm sure we'll see him later in the night. So John's group, without John, just continued going around the park, going on different rides, and for the next few hours, they kind of forgot about John. It wasn't until the end of the night, when over the loudspeaker, the park officials said, "Okay, we're closing the park now," that they started walking out and wondering where John was. And they were convinced, you know what, I'm sure he's back at the cars, he's probably waiting for us because he just wants to go home. So they leave the park, they get out to their cars in the lot, and John's not there. And so at this point, the group's starting to get a little bit concerned because no one knows where he is. They're meeting up with the other groups from their high school. No one's seen John. And so they're all just kind of staring at the front gate, waiting for John to come out, but he doesn't. And then eventually the lights in the park start shutting down and the security guard comes out front and locks the front gate. And that's when the group knew they had a problem. After an extensive investigation by police, this is their best guess as to what happened to John. After John and his small group rode that roller coaster around 9 p.m., John very quickly disembarked the ride before anybody else in his group could see him, and then John stumbled his way towards the replica Eiffel Tower that this park was famous for. This tower stood at about 300 feet tall and was built to be an exact replica of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, but this one at Kings Island was only a third the size. It had 3 elevators that went up the center of the structure, and the elevators would stop at a 50-foot platform and a 275-foot platform where guests could look out and have a great view of the park. While today, the only way to access these 2 viewing platforms is through these elevators, at the time John was at the park in 1983, the park actually had a flight of stairs that went from the ground all the way to the very top of the tower that went right up the middle of the structure, and the public was allowed to take these stairs all the way up to the first platform, that 50-foot platform. And while the stairs did actually continue beyond that, up to the 275-foot platform, the public was not allowed to go any higher on the stairs than that first platform. And so if you took these stairs, once you got to the 50-foot platform, there would be a big fence right on the stairwell preventing you from going any farther. And it says authorized personnel only, don't go any farther. And so the only people that would walk up those additional flights of stairs were staff that had a special key. When John stumbled his way over to the base of this replica tower, he did not get on an elevator. Instead, he took the stairs. So he made his way up to the 50-foot platform, and then when he got to this 6-foot tall gate preventing him from going any farther, he just climbed up and over it and continued walking up the stairs, and nobody stopped him. He finally came to a stop just below the 275-foot mark. And so he's on the stairwell, and at this point he turns and faces the inside of the tower. It's all these metal beams all over the place, and he climbs over the railing of the stairs he's on, and he climbs onto this narrow beam that's actually a part of the support structure of this tower, and he grabs onto the beam above him and just begins walking along this beam towards the center of the tower where the 3 elevator shafts are. Now, there's no safety net on either side of John, so if he slips and falls, he's falling hundreds of feet to the ground. And if he keeps walking and actually gets into the elevator shaft, there's nothing protecting him from being struck by one of the elevators, because the people who built this tower were not thinking about people walking on these exposed beams hundreds of feet up into the air. This is a totally dangerous and unauthorized area. But John just continues shimmying across this beam until he does get to the middle of the tower, and now he's literally standing looking down into the elevator shafts. And as he's most likely looking around, admiring where he was, one of the elevator cars below him began to start moving. To understand what happens next, you need to have a rudimentary understanding of how this elevator worked. A large metal rope was attached to the top of the elevator car, and from there it was thread up the elevator shaft all the way to the top, where it was fed through a pulley that was anchored to the ceiling, and then that rope was fed right back down the shaft to the bottom, where it was attached to a counterweight. A counterweight is just a large heavy weight that's designed to balance this elevator car on this pulley system. Without the weight, the elevator car would just slip off of that pulley. And so anytime the elevator car moved up, the counterweight would move down, and vice versa, making sure that car was always balanced. And so John is standing right on the edge of this elevator shaft, presumably just kind of looking around, admiring where he was, when down below him, that elevator car starts to move, and it starts to actually descend away from John. And so the car itself is not necessarily a threat to John. However, its counterweight is, because if the car is going down, its counterweight is going up. And it's right in the path of John. And so as John is leaning out over the shaft looking around, this counterweight comes screaming up and picks him off of the beam he's on and carries him up into the shaft. The impact on John was so strong that it's believed he was actually impaled on some of the exposed metal wiring on top of this counterweight, and he got totally tangled up in all of the cables on top of there. And so as John is desperately trying to free himself, the elevator operator, there was always a staff member inside of these elevator cars, he actually noticed when John got stuck on the counterweight. But of course, this worker would have no idea that's what it was. They would later recall, it just felt like the car suddenly jumped. And so this worker, fearing that something had gone wrong with the elevator car itself, he decided he would ride it all the way to the bottom, let everybody get out, and then ride back up to the top totally empty to make sure that the car actually worked before allowing people back on. And so the worker went to the ground, everybody got out and closed the doors. He began his ascent. He got to that first platform at 50 feet, no issues. He got about 10 feet above that first platform, so at about 60 feet, when all of a sudden he hears an unbelievably loud thud on the roof of his elevator car, causing his car to immediately come to a stop. And then blood began pouring over the sides of the car over the windows. After getting stuck on the counterweight, John probably did everything he could to try to free himself, but he just couldn't do it. However, when that elevator worker decided to go back up again to test the capacity of the elevator car, it reversed the direction of the counterweight that John was stuck on. And so as that car was going up, John began going down, and it was on this descent that parts of John's body must have been dangling off of this counterweight, and they must have struck one of the beams as he was going down, and that beam effectively pried him off of whatever he was stuck on and threw him over the edge into the center of the shaft. And so John would fall 200 feet and he would land on top of that elevator car, dying instantly. The park was very quick to block off the ride and the whole scene and got police involved very quickly, so only a very small number of guests and employees were aware an accident had even happened, and very few of them were aware that it had been a fatal accident. As for the police, they knew they had a dead body, but they had no way to identify the body. There was no ID cards on John, and so they had no way to let his friends know that were in the park or to tell his family. And so it wasn't until that night, when John's friends are out in the parking lot waiting for John to come out again, that they got really worried, and they went up and spoke to a security guard at the front of the park. And that security guard, after hearing their story, would tell them that actually there had been an accident in the park and there was a body, and the police are still trying to identify this body. And so maybe you guys want to go over to the hospital and see if it's your friend. So sure enough, the friends went to the hospital, and they would confirm that the body was John Harder. To this day, no one knows for sure why John did what he did. Some say he was just drunk and it was a dumb decision that led to his death. Others say he was suicidal, but many of the people that were close to him say, no way, he was not suicidal. And other people say, John, he loved attention, and so perhaps this was a dangerous stunt gone too far. But regardless of his reasons, John had clearly intentionally entered an area that was off limits, and it got him killed.
Our next story is called Under the Pier.
In the 1960s, Alan Burkhart opened a riverfront restaurant in Beaumont, Texas. And for the next 50 plus years, his customers would eat burgers, drink beers, and on super hot days, they would jump off the pier into the river to cool down. But one day in June of 2015, while Alan was in his restaurant looking out the back window, he saw something strange in the river. When he went outside to get a better look, he noticed his customers who were eating outside had also noticed this strange thing, and now they were standing up and nervously watching it as it floated by. Alan immediately yelled out to everyone to not go swimming, obviously, based on what they were seeing, and then he went back inside and made a sign that said no swimming, and he posted it on the pier. A few weeks later, on July 2nd, a 28-year-old local man named Tommy Woodward and his girlfriend, Victoria LeBlanc, arrived at Alan's restaurant for a fun night out. After several hours of drinking and playing pool, Tommy and his girlfriend made their way over to the bar and had a seat, at which point Tommy began telling his girlfriend that he planned on going swimming in the river that night. The bartender overheard him and said, "Tommy, you can't go swimming in the river anymore." But Tommy was a bit of a rule breaker and said he didn't care, he was going to go anyways. The bartender began pleading with him and even got other staff members of the restaurant to talk sense into Tommy that he should not get in the water. But eventually Tommy just stood up, he grabbed his girlfriend's hand, left the restaurant, and began walking down towards the pier. The bartender at this point just kind of rolled her eyes and thought, I can't do anything to stop him, and so she went back to her bartending duties. When Tommy and Victoria got down to the pier, the black water was quiet and calm as Tommy took off his shirt and removed his valuables from his pockets. Right before Tommy was about to jump into the water, Victoria stopped him and said she thought she saw something moving underneath the pier. But Tommy just laughed and said he didn't care and jumped into the water and disappeared below the surface. Immediately, the water around Tommy seemed to erupt like a bomb had gone off underneath him. When Tommy came back up to the surface, he was screaming and trying to swim back to the pier, but before he could get there, something pulled him under the water. And then a few seconds later, Tommy came back up again, and this time Victoria could see the left side of his torso was bleeding profusely. And so she instinctively leapt into the water to try to save him. And Tommy, even though he knew he needed help, he said to her, "Get back on land, save yourself." And so she obliged. She climbed back onto the pier, and when she turned around, she caught a final glimpse of Tommy as he was pulled back under the water, and this time he did not come back up again. The bartender had heard screaming and so ran down with a flashlight to the pier, and when she got there, Victoria was hysterical and she was yelling Tommy's name and looking out over the water, and so the bartender at this point is reasonably certain she knows what happened to Tommy, but if by some miracle he's still alive, she wants to find him. And so she raises her flashlight and she begins scanning the now totally calm black water, and as she's scanning, she finds him. He's floating face down way off in the middle of the river, and as soon as the flashlight hits him, something pulls his body under the water and he disappears from view. It was no secret that the river that ran next to Alan's restaurant was home to alligators. But these alligators were small and they didn't bother anybody, and so the locals really didn't have any issues swimming with them. In fact, they had nicknamed two of the alligators that were seen the most often. They named them Cheeto and Marshmallow. But on that day in June of 2015, when Alan and the other guests saw this thing out in the river, what they were seeing was a monster alligator, the likes of which they had never seen before in this river. It was at least 11 feet long and over 400 pounds, and that summer it decided to make the underside of Alan's pier its home. And so that night, when Tommy leapt into the water, it was this monster alligator's feeding time, and so Tommy became its dinner. About 2 hours after Tommy was attacked, what was left of him was recovered from the river. Tommy became the first alligator-related fatality in Texas in nearly 200 years.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Hide and Seek.
On or around June 10th, 2021, Jennifer Buell and her two sons, 12-year-old Charlie and 7-year-old Johnny, touched down at Cancun International Airport in Cancun, Mexico. The family, who lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was there for a nice long vacation during the kids' summer break, which had started just a few weeks earlier. After getting off the plane and getting their luggage, the Buell family made their way out of the airport and they hopped on a shuttle that brought them to their resort. They were staying at Club Med Cancun, which is a very popular all-inclusive family resort that's located right at the tip of the Riviera Maya. And the Riviera Maya is just stunningly beautiful. It's this stretch on the western side of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico that's basically all white sand beaches and beautiful clear turquoise water. But Club Med Cancun's fabulous location was not the only reason why families loved going there so much. Club Med, the huge hotel company behind this particular resort, is known for their gentils organisateurs. They call them GOs for short, and basically these are staff members employed by Club Med at all of their locations everywhere in the world whose sole job is to make sure the guests staying at their hotels have a truly unforgettable experience. And so these really friendly GOs are always walking around these hotels and talking to the guests and pointing them to the different places they can go within the hotel, and they encourage the guests to interact with each other and to participate in resort activities. And so a stay at a Club Med hotel, whether it's Cancun or anywhere in the world, is known to be very upbeat and highly interactive. So Jennifer and her two sons, they get off the shuttle at Club Med Cancun, they go inside, they get checked in, they make their way to their room, they drop their bags, and then they head out to explore the hotel. And pretty much right away, there were GOs all over the place coming up to welcome them to the hotel and pointing them to the best restaurants, the best places to go swimming, and what activities were coming up that night and what to look forward to that week. And right away, what stood out to the Buell family, specifically Charlie and Johnny, was the Kids Club / Teens Club. Basically, the GOs organized really fun games and activities just for the kids, depending on what age they were. And so this was really appealing to Charlie and Johnny to go play with other kids. And it was appealing to Jennifer because this would mean she could go off and actually relax because she would have childcare. So, starting that first night and over the next week they were in Cancun, Jennifer made sure they always were around the resort so that the boys could just take off and go hang out with this kids club, teen club whenever they wanted. And so the routine that the Buell family adopted over the course of their vacation was they would get up early, they would go to the white sand beaches right outside of their resort, and then after coming back to the resort, Charlie would almost always cut loose and go hang out for the rest of the day with the kids in the teen club, kids club, and Johnny, he mostly stayed with his mom, but over the course of the day, he would leave and do one-off activities with the club. And then at 9:15 p.m. at night, the trio would always link up on the pool deck and they would make their way in to see one of the shows that the GOs were putting on, ranging from comedy sketches to circus tricks. And so all in all, the Buell family vacation to Cancun, Mexico was really going as well as it could have been, until a simple game of hide and seek changed everything. On June 18th, so roughly 1 week after the Buell family had arrived in Mexico, the family got up and they began their typical vacation routine. They headed to the beach, and then afterwards, Charlie broke off and went to spend time with the kids at the teen club, kids club, and Johnny and Jennifer, they mostly stayed together for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, around 8:30 p.m., after all three of the Buells had had dinner, they decided to split up before rejoining at 9:15 to go in and see a show. Johnny wanted to head downstairs and go see a kids-only show. Jennifer wanted to head up to the second level to have chocolate fondue dessert with a friend she had made at the resort. And Charlie wanted to meet up with his friends from the Kids Club, Teens Club out on the pool deck where the GOs were organizing a big game of hide and seek. And so after watching his mother walk upstairs to the fondue restaurant and watching his younger brother head downstairs to the kids-only show, Charlie turned and ran towards the pool deck. And when he got there, he immediately linked up with his best friend from the vacation, a 13-year-old named Cyrus, and very quickly after that, the GOs who were on the pool deck with all these other kids that were out there, they said, okay, we're gonna start counting, you guys all hide. And so the GOs, they walked to the side of this big pool deck, they covered their eyes, they began counting, and all the kids, Charlie and Cyrus included, scattered to find the best hiding spot. And right away, as Charlie and Cyrus are looking for places to hide, they're seeing the other kids are taking up all the best hiding spots. And so for a second, they're panicking. They're not going to have a good spot. Then both of the boys looked over to the side of the pool deck and they realize there is a perfect hiding spot that nobody's taken. Around the outside of this huge open-air pool deck was a metal fence. It was only a couple of feet tall, and it was made up of metal bars so you could see right through it. It was basically in place just to denote the edges of the resort property. And on one length of this perimeter fence, the south side of this fence, there was a gate built into this fence. And this gate was almost always closed and locked. The only time it was opened was when a GO or another hotel staff member would open it to lead guests out of the resort property to go off and do some excursion. But for some reason, on the night of June 18th, this fence was wide open. On the other side of this fence was just a small rectangular platform that jutted out about 10 feet from the pool deck, same level as the pool deck. And if you were standing on this platform with your back to the pool deck, on your left side would be a very small flight of stairs, just a couple of steps going down. And so Charlie and Cyrus, they look over and they see this gate is open, and they know there are those stairs kind of tucked down below the platform, and they're thinking, if we crouch down on those steps, no one will see us from the pool deck. We'll be obscured from view. And so Charlie and Cyrus, they run over to the open gate, they go through, they walk down a couple of steps, and they kind of tuck themselves down so they can barely look up and over onto the pool deck to see if anyone's coming, but they can tell there's no way anyone is going to see them unless they literally walk through the gate and are looking down the steps at them. And so Charlie and Cyrus, they're giggling with excitement because they know they have found the perfect hiding spot. And they're listening as the GOs are calling out, okay, ready or not, here we come. And after a couple of minutes, they're hearing the sound of the GOs finding all the other kids all over the pool deck. You know, there were some really good hiding spots, but eventually all the kids are found except for Charlie and Cyrus. And so Charlie and Cyrus, they start looking at each other and they're really excited about this, but they know no one's going to find them. But right before Cyrus and Charlie stood up and revealed themselves, Cyrus happened to notice there was a hose, like a garden hose, that was draped down the steps that they were on, and for some reason, the water was turned on. And so Cyrus grabbed the hose, and as he stood up, turning away from Charlie, he began spraying the water onto the pool deck, onto the GOs and all the kids who didn't know where they were. And so everybody on the pool deck is suddenly laughing and running away from the water. It's totally chaos, and Cyrus thinks it's hysterical. He's still just spraying everybody down. And then at some point, Cyrus stops and turns to see what Charlie's reaction is to this absolute bedlam that he's created on the pool deck. But when Cyrus turns around, Charlie's not there. Meanwhile, two other hotel guests who had nothing to do with this game of hide and seek, it was a mother and her adult son, they were having a meal up in the second floor restaurant that overlooked the pool deck. And as they're sitting there enjoying their meal, they suddenly hear the sound of boys screaming. Now, immediately, they both can tell this is not a play scream. Someone is actually in danger, someone is hurt, something's going on here, and they try to look down onto the pool deck where these screams seem to be coming from, but they can't tell. It's dark out there, they can't see what's going on, and so acting on instinct, the woman and her son just stand up and start running through the restaurant and making their way downstairs. And as they're doing this, the woman's husband actually sees her charging through, and he, along with two other boys that happen to be near him, just start running after them, knowing that whatever's going on, it's bad, so they have to go help. And so when these 5 people get down to the pool deck, they hear the sound of the boys screaming again, and they can tell it's coming from that open gate, that platform area where Charlie and Cyrus had been hiding. And so these 5 people charge through the still open gate. They go out onto this platform and they look down the little flight of stairs and they see Cyrus. They don't see anybody else on the platform. It's just this one boy, and he looks totally shaken up, totally hysterical, and it's clear he is one of the boys that was screaming. And then before they could even ask him what was going on, they hear a sound coming from somewhere below the steps. And they all turn, and literally, out of the darkness, Charlie just suddenly emerges, and he looks up at the adults and just says in a very calm voice, "Save me, save me." This normally completely off-limits, fenced-off platform that jutted out past the pool deck where the boys were hiding, that was actually a dock that sat over a swampy lagoon, and underneath that dock was a nest of crocodiles. And when Cyrus and Charlie were on that lower step, the crocodiles had noticed them, and when Cyrus had stood up and begun spraying the water onto the pool deck, one of those crocodiles, a 13-foot monster, had come out of the water, turned around, and literally leapt up onto those steps, bit Charlie by the leg, and pulled him into the water. The screams that woman and her son had heard while they were in that restaurant were Cyrus's and Charlie's, because initially when Charlie was pulled into the water, he didn't go directly under. And so Cyrus had managed to grab onto Charlie's arms, and he was trying to pull Charlie out of the crocodile's mouth, and the two of them were screaming for help. But by the time that woman and the other 4 people got down to the platform, Cyrus lost his grip on Charlie, and the croc and Charlie went under the water. And so those 5 people were standing there when the crocodile and Charlie just came back out of the water. And that's when Charlie was saying, "Save me, save me." He was in the crocodile's mouth. And when these 5 people saw Charlie and understood what was going on, without any hesitation, the adults leapt into the dark lagoon waters that are clearly infested with crocodiles and began beating the crap out of this crocodile. And while this melee is happening in these dark, murky lagoon waters with crocodiles everywhere, someone had gone into the fondue bar and told Jennifer, "Your son's being attacked by a crocodile." And she instantly leapt up and just ran across the restaurant, knocking anything over that was in her way. And finally, she got downstairs to the pool deck. She went through that gate out to that platform, and she saw her boy. Charlie was laying on his back, surrounded by totally frantic and hysterical adults. Charlie's leg looked like it had been through a meat grinder, but Charlie was awake and he was talking to the adults near him. In the time it took Jennifer to run through the restaurant and get down to the pool deck, those adults who had leapt into the murky lagoon water to fight with this crocodile had literally beaten it so badly that it released Charlie. And according to the people who watched this happen, this crocodile was putting up an unbelievable fight. It was whipping its head side to side, tearing into Charlie's leg. It kept pulling Charlie deeper and deeper into the water, and these adults just didn't stop. They were yanking on this crocodile, punching its eyes, gouging its eyes, and finally it worked. When Charlie was finally pulled to safety and was laying on the dock, he was in rough shape, and no one knew if he was going to survive or not. But luckily, there just happened to be a trauma nurse who was staying at the resort who came outside. She assessed the situation and she took charge. She stopped the bleeding in his leg and she stayed with him and kept him calm until paramedics finally arrived. Charlie would be rushed to the hospital where he would immediately undergo several surgeries that would save his life. Also, surgeons were able to miraculously save his leg. Initially, it seemed like he might have to have it amputated. As for Club Med, their response to this incident was enormous. Not only did they pay for all of Charlie's medical bills, but they also invested a lot of money into securing not only that fence and gate that led to the dock where he was attacked, but also just generally speaking around the resort to make sure there were no more attacks. Today, Charlie is back in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania with his family, and considering the horrible trauma he went through, he's remarkably well adjusted. In fact, in the Halloween that followed this attack, Charlie dressed up as a crocodile.
Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time you're working at the county fair selling ice cream and the Amazon Music follow button comes up to you to buy a vanilla cone, sell them one, but instead of using vanilla ice cream, use vanilla mayonnaise. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mrballen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mrballen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime.